As always, thank you everybody for attending this morning. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I want to remind everybody that if you are on speakerphone, that's fantastic. You're more than welcome to stay on speakerphone and ask. Just consider muting yourself so that everybody else isn't hearing side conversations or other things that are going on, as well as the feedback that comes through. But if you have a question, feel free to speak up. Just remember to unmute yourself when you come back into the conversation. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and preface a little bit of what we're talking here. So to cover this one through, I want to look at identifying theft in the restaurants, and it's especially recently been a very common topic. We've had lots of people inquiring about both what it looks like in the POS system as well as just sort of pervasively. Unfortunately, that seems to be just a sign of the times of what we're dealing with right now, and is a very strong indicator of where our employees and our customers both seem to be in terms of the economy and things like that. What I'm going to go through here is some of the things both for the way it looks in Aloha, what are the big indicators, as well as how Aloha can help you deal with and adjust to the theft that's taking place even in the physical world, not necessarily through the POS system. Aloha has a lot of systems that are built in place to tie into those other aspects because we know it's such a big concern with our staff and those things. And it's a broad topic, and criminals have no end of resourcefulness in their approach to where there's holes in the system, they will take advantage of it. And whether they're labeling it as theft or accidental, those things still all come into play. We're going to go through those systems, and then some of them that get just consistent and crazy if and it's pervasive. We're going to have Renee touch base on some of the systems that automate this process to take the time-consuming portion of it out of your hands, and also as well as look for ones that are really complex and are just kind of beyond the scope of where we're at here, especially for persistent problems, or if you happen to be in an area where that's just the intrinsic culture in the food and beverage industry in your area. So with that in mind, I'm going to go through some of those things here. And first and foremost, I want to remind you that this is just a broad look, first of all. It is going to be a broad look all the way ahead. Who is stealing? And unfortunately, the answer is almost every position in the restaurant has both access and means at various times in the operation. And then the line between identifying it and control. There is a conversation to be had here about both identifying the problems, narrowing them down, investigating them, looking into them, and then the preventative where we're actually setting up controls to limit the opportunity and help keep people honest in the same way that locks on your door do. They don't deter a determined thief who's going out to do it, but they're still there to keep honest people honest. And then lastly, I really have to put our disclaimer in here. Just because it looks like theft does not mean that it is. This is the beginning of the process. And we don't want you to have a conversation here with, while we're having this webinar, suddenly realize, oh my God, I think Dave's stealing from me, and turn around and I don't want to hear somebody unmuting so that we can listen to them fire somebody on the spot. This is to go investigate those things. It's to look into them. Please make sure that, in all cases, you're still covering your bases, documenting any discretions that people have, both through printouts and documentation, but also going through that process, whatever it may be for your area, whether that is a 3 strikes rule where you have to write them up, suspend them, and then termination. But it's always, of course, as an owner and a manager, your responsibility to make sure that you're complying with the law and with, anything that you may be obligated to cover in unemployment hearings. So with that, we're going to go ahead here and talk about this. The base statistic right now is just this: 75% of all employees steal at some point. Now, that's not always including intentional theft. That can be theft by opportunity, theft by accident, theft by neglect, those types of things. Persistently, a problem with discount codes that are being used, and those are easy to manipulate, especially for people who have access to them. And the NRA is currently saying that it's just 3% of your profit is going out to theft. And quite frankly, our industry doesn't make the kind of money where 3% is trivial to throw away. We're dealing with pennies on the dollar and long hours, and it's important. So with that in mind, I'm going to go through the broad categories of it, and we're going to start with sales theft. That is first and foremost what everybody thinks of when they talk about theft in their POS system. They are looking at what they want to do in theft. So we're going to take a look at what your daily reports are and what the flags, the warnings, the indicators are when we look at your reports, what it is that we're looking for. So looking at your daily report, you should be running every morning as your point of sale, your sales report. So you can see there at the bottom, I've put the path for you where we're taking a look at it, and it's the sales summary report. Most people run this daily. You also run this quarterly for doing taxes, and also, weekly or monthly if you're doing inventories. And you get a report that is typically 3 to 4 pages long, depending on what your settings are. And these can be in different orders, so please don't look for it as the top of the second page. But when you're looking at these reports, we can customize them. There's a couple big flags that we want to take a look at. Voids in the Aloha system is anything that was rung in through the point of sale system, but was never physically made. And the reason this is an indicator and something that we want to keep an eye on is it could be something innocent, where you have a new employee who was just checking the price on things and was ringing them in and then walked away from the screen and then ordered them. Or it could be that somebody is actually deleting those transactions. And the way this one rolls into a daily theft, I'll cover a little more in an example later, but it's them deleting the items out after they've collected the money for them. So if we have a large pattern of voids here, we want to look into it to make sure that hopefully it's that one-off thing where it's a training incident, not that it's a repeat that every time we see significant voids, it's the same employee or the same shift or the same manager, those types of things. So we just want to keep in mind that this needs to be a reasonable number, and we'll get that idea by looking at our sales reports every day, what is normal for us and what's a very unusual amount of voids, or is it consistently rising. Comps are anything that actually was made in the system, and where the comps come into play on it is if you have a sudden large amount of them that's not tied to a direct return, then you want to make sure that it's not an opportunity. Now, my background here is I spend a lot of time traveling around the Midwest investigating theft for a hospitality company, and in part because I take theft as very personal. One of the things we had here was a manager who had access to the system, who was going in after the hours of operation, after the restaurant had closed, and no one else was there to keep an eye on him. So that manager was coming into the establishment, was deleting the employees' clockouts, deleting their checkouts, comping $100 in ribs, rerunning their checkout, rerunning their clockout, adjusting the clockout time back to the time that the employee left, and then just pocketing the $100 that he had comped out. We noticed that because there was a change in the amount of comps that was taking place over a broad range of time, and it looked unusual. So we want to look at things that are in the comps, as well as this would include promotions, which are your coupons. And so if you had an employee who was going out and checking, you had a $5 coupon running in the newspaper in town, they go put 35 cents in the newspaper at the corner and pull out a stack of newspapers, cut out their own coupons, and start turning them into you. So we need to have a check and balance for that as well. Making sure that the sales are proportionate, your beverage mix. So if you have an operation here, we want to make sure that your beverages, of course, are certainly at least proportional to the number of checks, at least one for every guest. If not, that could be an indicator that your employees are recycling beverages from ticket to ticket. So they're going ahead and reusing them over and over and over again. So you'll see that that proportion drops quite a bit. Refunds should be rare. This is something that you would be primarily concerned of, that if you see it, that a manager had access to running it. Likely, if you are seeing this, it's a manager who is in fact using this. Your check counts by day part. And this is one that you should have a good feel looking at this report on a day-to-day basis as well. So if you're looking at your guest counts, and you know that we usually on a Monday lunch have about 50 people, and then today I'm only showing that we had about 35 and it still felt like 50, then maybe we want to start looking into those guest counts, because these can be tilted both ways by employees. If it is too low on the guest counts, it means they are actually just recycling the entire check. If it is too high, then it's because they're splitting the checks and reusing them that way. So either way can be an indicator that there's a different scam going on. And this is something that Restaurant Guard does very well in looking into. If there are a lot of sales that were rung in as don't make, that can often be a collusion between the kitchen and the front of the house. So what's happening here is that the kitchen is go ahead and making that item too and ringing it in, whether that be for a guest benefit or an employee's benefit. Here, I'll just go ahead and make you a meal, and I'm going to have it rung in as don't make, and then have somebody comp it off. Just something worth following into. Under your payments detail report, also that you're going to be running on a daily basis, the payment detail is a little more straightforward, but what we're looking here is at actually the bottom section. So once we've made it past all the credit cards and those transactions that are located at the beginning of your payment detail report, now we want to go ahead and we want to take a look at what is actually on the itemized comps. And this is very straightforward. What we're really looking for here are just patterns. Is it always the same employee that's turning in that $5 promotional coupon? Is it always the same manager who is giving that guest satisfaction comp because they're the ones pocketing the money? Or is it always being done at the same time of day? Those things indicate that there's something afoot, so we want to look into them further. And when I say that we want to look into them further, we're going to in a minute. I'm going to show you what the tools are for how we delve into that a little bit more detailed. Also, what are the exceptions that are being put in here? Is it an exception? Is it an unusual comp? Make sure that we're putting as many reasons in here as we feel adequate in our establishment to track it. You can create as many comp categories and void reasons as you need to. And the reason is, if you have the void categories and the comp categories set up with lots of comps and lots of voids so that it actually reflects, it allows you to have an easier time looking into that. If I just say staff error, that's an extremely broad category for me, and I don't know where I'm investigating to find out that is true. But if it says kitchen error in my comp category, well, then I can hold my manager accountable by double checking on them and going and asking my kitchen staff. I know who to start with and say, okay, what was the story behind that ribeye that had to be comped out on Friday for kitchen error? And it lets me know who I'm looking for. I'm looking for that specific back of the house employee, probably my broil cook in that instance. So those are a good place to benefit as well. On your employee reports here, the basics one that you're going to be looking at every single day under your employee reports. One, you can sort out which employees have access to the back of the house and which have access to only the front of the house. So start by just managing your permissions in the back of the house. There are reports you can run. You can also sort them by that. So when you actually bring up your employees in the Aloha Manager in the back, you'll notice in the pull down where you would go choose an employee, right there it gives a system access description. The employees listed there that have POS and above store are the employees that have access to the manager's computer in the office. So that means they can set up comps, they can change some settings and things like that. So you just want to make sure that's tightly controlled. Make sure that only people who have access to the system in the back of the house are people who need to have access in the back of the house. And then also, correspondingly, we want to make sure that we terminate out employees that are no longer working for us, terminate them in the system. That way it deactivates their number, and any permissions that they had can't be used by other employees who happen to know their number or know how to use the system. So with that, those things being looked at on our basic daily reports, what is actually happening that those employees are doing to make those things show up on our reports, and how do we look into them in the front of the house? What are we seeing? And the basics goes like this. So the normal system that your employees are going to be doing is that they ring in the cheeseburger and the iced tea. They print that check out, so they've got a check with a total of $9. They go to your staff and they collect that $9. At the end of that process, they're going to have this $9 check. And normally what they would be doing is collecting that check, closing it, and that would reopen the revenue center so that they can use that check a second time. The reason this is broken in most of these systems is they're not following that portion where they collect the money and close it. So open checks tend to be a flag as you're going through operations in the front of the house and looking at your checks. We want to know that those checks weren't closed. If I'm going to break that system, one of the ways I can do that is after I've collected the money from them. So I'm still ringing in the order, I'm still printing the check, I'm taking it to my table and collecting the $9. But instead, this time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reprint that check multiple times. This is extremely common when we're dealing with repetitive specials. So our most commonly sold special during lunch, if we are running a feature for the day, say our featured item for the day is going to be a barbecue pork sandwich. Well, then that barbecued pork sandwich, since that's the feature on the board and that's what we're most likely to be selling that day, is also the item that's most likely to be taking advantage of this. Daily specials are prone to this, as well as the beverages that are common. So iced tea being your most commonly sold beverage in normal operations. So I could go ahead, print that cheeseburger and iced tea check, not once, but go ahead and print it 5 times and then give that check to the next 4 people who order a cheeseburger and iced tea as well and collect it. So we could go ahead here and reprint checks that way. Another way that we can abuse it, especially if we were doing it for beverages, is to go ahead and split the check. So what we're going to want to do here is, instead of closing the check after we've collected the $9, I'm going to go ahead and split the cheeseburger and the iced tea apart. I'll close the cheeseburger. Now the next person comes in and they order that pulled pork sandwich. I'm just going to ring the pulled pork sandwich on the same check as the iced tea, and then I'm going to go ahead and print that check. So I've given the iced tea now has appeared on several different checks that is printed to several different customers. And that's why, because I'm using the same check with the iced tea, that's why my guest count would be unusually low that day, because I'm not starting a new check requiring me to enter in a new guest count. So my guest check is going to be artificially low. So if I do that, I can go ahead and just keep using that same beverage. And at, $2.50, $3 a beverage on a repeat, that can be another, $20 on your shift, $40 in a day if you're working a double. Bartenders are particularly able to do the same thing as well. And that's part of the reason why Aloha puts the fast cash when they do their closed checks out in such giant print across the screens. We want to make sure that the customer has every indication that the actual correct amount is being rung into the system each time they perform a transaction. Transferring the check is usually done in pairs. So when we do transferring the checks, the way this would work is I would work in conjunction with somebody. So let's say if Renee and I were involved in this, then Renee and I would go ahead and do the same thing. More likely that two people are going to have the transactions that are repetitive, and it also allows me to hide the items. So if I have somebody comes in and orders that cheeseburger and iced tea, and I'm working with Renee, I can keep an eye on it. And if Renee has somebody with a cheeseburger and iced tea, I'll go ahead and transfer or print the check for her benefit. This also allows those to keep those off. So when you're looking at the table as in transit between me and Renee, it's not appearing as a seated table on your floor plan. So when the manager at a glance looks at the floor plan and says, how many tables are we have open? We have 4. I see 4. Okay, we're good. But that check is still out there floating around. If we looked at our transfer tables to see transfers that haven't yet completed, we may see that there's a transfer check out there. Depending on your settings, it also allows me to rename them. So even though that the cheeseburger that I gave the check to the first time was sitting at table 4, and now the next person is at table 6, I can go ahead and transfer it to myself or transfer it to someone else and make it table 6 when it comes in. It just makes it less likely that my manager is going to notice I have table 4 open when the guest is actually sitting at table 6. This is the reason that by default, Aloha tends to shut off transfers, and we tend to configure your system without transfers. We keep in mind the accountability and the security when you're set up the system, and then almost immediately begin making compromises for the sake of convenience. And this is one of the things that a lot of times you don't want to involve a manager on a day-to-day basis, constantly having to stop what they're doing to go out and just help a server transfer tables so they can rename them and so forth. And then by doing that, we're allowing them to have access to this scheme. And Renee actually has some better examples of this. She'll go through that in a little more detail as well on how this works. Going through here, then when we go back to our reporting on our back of the house settings, to look into this, there actually is a report called a transfer report. So when you go into the Aloha Manager, you're going to go under Point of Sale and Reports. All the way down there, you can see that we have a transfer report. And the transfer report is looking for those kind of clues. What it is doing is it's giving me a list of all the transfers that took place during that meal period. So we get an idea here that we are looking for specifically repeat transactions from the same employees, or other things that are off. So here we've got a multiple transfers. You can see that an employee transferred the table to the bar, and then it came back to them, and it was the same table being passed around. Why is that? And there may be a legitimate reason. It may be that that customer decided they were going to join a table, they saw some friends, and then they realized the friends weren't going to be eating, so maybe they moved back to their original table. Or maybe it's over a significant period of time where they were bar hopping and moving from server section to server section. There could be logical reasons, but we want to look into those reasons and make sure that there actually is a story behind it, and maybe there's other detail to it. Additionally, I need to put a note here for bars specifically. If your bartenders are using that function in Aloha that allows your manager or your bartenders to access to each other's tabs by hitting exit, it does not exit all the way out of the screen. Where if you hit exit, instead of going back out to the screensaver, it just shows you a list of bartenders. Then that also counts as a transfer. So if me and Renee are sharing bar tabs and I grab her tab from her to put a beer on it for her customer while Renee's in the back changing a keg, what's going to happen is that's going to show up as 2 transfers. One where it transfers that ticket from her to myself, and then one where it transfers it from me back to her when I have finished. So just because you see a high volume of transfers on here between 2 people, make sure that they're not bartenders just using get check function from each other. Same with cashiers. Cashiers, it shows up as a transfer when it is transferring the table from a bartender to a cashier. Time gaps are a big indicator on this. If we are seeing that those times, those transfers, or those reprints are appearing about 30 minutes apart or 40 minutes apart at dinner, then that's an indication that we need to look into that further as well, because that means that there may have been legitimately a turnover in those tables before they're redoing it. As opposed to if it was all happening in a moment or 5 minutes apart, then it's maybe they just had to reprinted the check, realized it was wrong, transferred the check, and then the table decided they were going to stay anyway. So the server decided to, no, just transfer it back to me, then I'll go ahead and take care of them. Just make sure that there's actually a reasoning behind it. And then also here, we're looking for manager involvement. So primarily, I am looking for your assistant or your temporary managers. We want to make sure that they're not having access to it almost habitually. I'm a part-time manager. I have access to this, so I'm going to go ahead and see what I can get away with when I have manager permissions, or your managers who are always in conjunction. And what we also have to keep an eye out for when we're looking at these is it always the same manager with the same employee? Because if we have a connection between our managers and employees, that shows up as them having common transactions all the time. So if I'm a manager and I happen to be related to an employee who works in my establishment, or I happen to be roommates with them, and I'm going to go ahead and make sure that they have the money to make rent this week, because if not, it's going to affect me. So those transactions can have arbitrary reasons that are outside of the restaurant and not directly involved to the employees committing the fraud, because they have a vested interest in that other person's profitability outside of work. And then here, same receipts. So if we're seeing that same thing is printed out, this is also an indication we want to look, were they just printing it and doing the same receipt because it was the same table? Were they using it as a tool to renumber the tables or rename the tables? Again, just flags, things that you need to investigate further into. And that may mean keeping an eye on that employee. It may mean following up and asking an employee or a table, oh, I saw that you had a transfer on your table. Did you change your mind? Is everything okay? Are we taking care of you? Is there something we can do better to make it easier for you next time? Conversationally, you can make those non-inquisitive with a customer or a staff by still going out and talking to them and finding out what really happened. And then the last big tool is audits. And this is an overwhelmingly complex tool, because Aloha systemically records every transaction that's taking place during the day. Everything that you do is recorded. Everything that you do is kind of logged, and that seems obtuse, and it's a large amount of volume, and it's not there because it's Big Brother, but it's there for when you have those things. I would never encourage you to run an audit report and sit there and go through it every day. The amount of information in an audit report is overwhelming. This can easily run into, for a busy restaurant, seriously, 178 pages. Okay, this is a tool that you come into when you're looking for something specific and you want to go ahead and investigate it. So what you do here when you go under audit, and this is the same tool that we use quite often when you call into us and say, hey, I'm trying to look into something, can you help me see what was going on? Is we go into the audit screen here. And under the audit, we're allowed to access a lot of parameters. You can see here, looking at the audit, we have a place to enter in the time. So this helps narrow it down. If we know that it's something that happened during lunch, I may do from 11 o'clock until, like, say, 1400 here, or 1500, selecting the specific employee I'm looking for if I'm following up on something where I think an employee has created fraudulent behavior, or I can do all employees if I'm just looking to see, does my staff have a problem with transfers and voids? I could run it for my entire staff for a day and hit transfers and also get a transfer report that way, or get a void report, or if I can see if they're reprinting checks a lot. And every time you print a check, it puts a number after it in the void report. I'll show you in a moment. But when we go through here, so what we're primarily looking for is we want to keep an eye on comps. You've got the ability to check those up here. The promos that we looked at are in here. Over here, you've got the ability to take a look at where there are reopens of checks, where there are transfers going on. Cleared items would be an indicator that your bartender is actually going in, ringing in the beer in front of the customer because the customer does not have a good line of sight to the bar terminal, popping open the drawer, but then deleting the beer, and then not actually doing the close because the customer can't see the giant amount pop up. And if you're actually inclined or you're having problems in those, Aloha has something called Aloha Spy that ties into the camera systems that actually allows you through your camera system in your restaurant, not only watch what your bartenders are doing, but as they ring in things, it shows them on the camera screen so that we can keep an eye on it. If that physical theft like that is a problem, or you have a security issue where you think problems might be walking out the back door, please make sure you talk to us, because there are things that we can do to help you on that front as well. So when we go ahead and we run our audit report, make our selections here, you're going to get a very long report that looks something like this. And it's an item by item, moment by moment breakdown. We get to see who did what, how they did it, where they were standing when they did it. What we're trying to get here out of this is the story of what was going on. So you can see, okay, this employee was standing at this table. You can see they forgot to ring in the payment, the promo amount, so they deleted the item. They went back, they had a manager apply that comp, and then they went ahead and printed the check a second time. So that's why it shows as a reprint for multiple printing of the checks. something transpired in between those. Or you can see that the customer went ahead and ordered a second beer after the check was printed, and so then they went and rang that in and then reprinted the check again. This is a great tool for ruling out theft because you can actually see the story of what happened, and it's no longer arbitrary. You don't actually have to go to your employee and accuse them of, hey, I think there's some suspicious behavior. Tell me what's going on. Now, on the flip side of that, you can go ahead and you can run these reports, and if you want to have a moment where you need to really put some fear into your staff or scare them, feel free to print out a couple of pages of this and sit up at the bar with a highlighter one morning as your staff's coming in and say, hey, I see that you rang in a beer at 7:53 last night and then you deleted it. Why? And then they know you're watching every single keystroke. It's not something you're going to want to do every day, but you can do that visually to make a point with your staff. Labor theft. So the labor theft is the one that comes in here that you look at your labor reports every day. When you run in your employee labor report, we encourage you to do this daily to audit your punches to make sure that your employees were clocked in both as the same correct job code and clocked out at the right times. If you wait until payroll is done, especially if you're biweekly, and you look at it and you say, Dave didn't clock out. The system clocked him out at 4 a.m. last week. What time did he really leave? You're not going to remember. Dave's not going to remember. Nobody's going to know. It's much easier the more often you do this because you're closer to the actual problem. You're closer to the source of the error. So what we're looking at here, and this is one that employees as a rule don't tend to view as actually as intentional theft, but you do from time to time. So when an employee is coming in, they're stealing labor from you because you're getting nothing in return for it. When they come in a half hour before their shift, they clock in, and then they go have a cigarette, change into their work uniform, make a quick phone call home, and then start working. The things that you're looking for on this labor report, specifically to make sure that are correct, are where they clocked in as the correct job code. Is it an instance where the employee accidentally, with quotation marks around it, clocked in as a cook instead of a dishwasher Friday night just because their rent is coming up due and they make more money as a cook? It's got a better pay rate. Or accidentally clocked in as a server trainer. To help mitigate these things, you can make sure that the job codes are in the order that you want them in on the employee, because when the employee record lists server first, that's the one they'll most likely accidentally clock in. Did they forget to clock out? And we'll know because your system will run an end of day. So whatever time your system runs your end of day, typically 4 a.m., you'll notice that as the clock out time on here, and that means the employee didn't clock out. The system automatically clocked him out when the end of day ran. Did they have breaks and they chose not to take them? If you happen to be in an area where they are required to take breaks or entitled to take breaks, you can go ahead and put enforcement in there and set up rules to mandatory make sure that they take that time and they are clocking out. You're not paying for time they were supposed to be on break. You can also regulate for your front of the house staff with bartenders and servers when they take those breaks. Are they allowed to take them with open tables? So if you're in an area where employees who are not able to be 100% relieved of their duties are entitled to take paid breaks, you can still keep track of those paid breaks. And then if they had any overtime, is it planned or improved? And here what I mean by this being theft is, did the employee volunteer to pick up a shift from someone else knowing that the only reason they were really taking it is because later in the week that will go ahead and push them into overtime. So one, you're going to see it showing up in your overtime report. There's also a report for overtime warning that shows you that an employee is about to come into overtime so that you can preemptively schedule, hey, I know you picked up a shift on Tuesday. I'm going to go ahead and have that employee who was sick pick up your shift on Friday now. And then also, were these times edited appropriate? I mentioned before that we had a manager who was at a location who was coming in and after hours deleting clockouts and then comping ribs. This is where that shows up. So what we're seeing here is when we go to the labor report, we are seeing that the people's punches were always edited an hour after close every time that manager was working. So by taking a look at those times that your punches have been edited and that they're always edited by the same manager, that can show you a pattern of abuse and a pattern of behavior as well. Owners, this is particularly important to keep an eye on your managers. Your manager can pad a coworker's or friend's or a roommate or a family member's wage even without them knowing it, just by adjusting their times after close. And then make sense. Are there declared tips? And the reason this is an indicator, and fortunately WatchGuard is the best tool for looking at this, especially because it alerts you in a timely fashion that this is starting to take place, is you'll notice that there's a giant rise in your declared tips for your employees because they have to declare credit card tips. And one of the ways that this makes sense is that your employees are giving away free drinks to their friends who then, instead of having to pay for it, are just tipping them well as a way of saying thank you. So their tip proportion is unusually high for the amount of sales that they have rung in through the system, and that sudden jump in their tips is an indicator that maybe they didn't actually earn those tips they're ringing. So we can also go ahead, and there's a basic tool in here called the Basic Labor Scheduler. It's a very basic tool with very basic functionality, but we can go ahead and put our staff schedules into Aloha. It's a drag and drop interface. It shows which day of the week they're working and which job code they're working, and then you can set punctuality controls around this so that your employees are required to clock in within the time of their scheduled shift. So they can't clock in a half hour before, they can only clock in 5 minutes before their shift, and I just saved 25 minutes worth of labor that was probably going to be wasted because they didn't need to be there. Your managers still have the flexibility to go ahead and allow the employees to clock in at the front of the house. If I come in early and I see you're busy and I go to swipe in to jump in and help you guys because you're getting hammered, I can go ahead and swipe a manager's card to give me permission to go ahead and clock in anyway, even though I'm not scheduled at the time. And your overtime warning in the back looks something like this. This is just to allow you to clock it beforehand. When you run that overtime report, it's going to say, okay, looking through the end of the week, this employee is projected to go over their scheduled too many hours. They were scheduled 40 hours, but they're already at 30 and they have several shifts remaining. So it's just a preemptive tool to help you prevent those before you get to that situation. Overtime is costly if it's not necessary. On the front of kitchen and physical theft, these are the ones that are a little bit harder to see, and this is why we want to run our product mix report. So the product mix report has a function built into it that most people are not actively taking advantage of. They're using it for the other things in here, for prepping waste, for freeing up purchasing capital, reducing labor, maximizing profit, and so forth. But you'll notice that when we look here, this cost column is completely empty. And so without the cost here, you can't tell what your actual calculated food cost should be as opposed to your theoretical. And I'll show you why this matters. Your cost of goods is your starting inventory plus your purchase, and that's my ending inventory, or your starting of the next period inventory. And that's how you know what your theoretical and actual food costs are. Here's what's happening. So if I'm in a restaurant and I have a food cost that is 2%, and my menu price is $6, I have a gross profit of $4 on it, and I've got a 30% food cost. My steak is 10%, or $10, I'm selling it for $20, so it's got a 50% food cost. If I'm selling nothing but steaks on my menu, there's no way I will ever run a 30% food cost in my restaurant. Can't get there. And that's okay, because I want to sell the 50% food cost steaks because I'm taking more dollars to the bank. For every $10 I'm investing, I'm taking 10 back and going straight to the bank with that. That's what I'm looking at here. So we've got a 50% food cost and a 30% food cost, and that's my high end and my low end. And my actual food cost for the month or week is going to be somewhere in between those numbers based on the mix of product I sold. If I sold more steaks, it's going to go more one way. If I sold more burgers, it's going to go more the other. When we go back and look at our reports and set up our items, that's so important to the system reporting that it actually appears right on the main screen when you create an item. So every time you add an item, right there after you put in the name, the very next thing is a line for you to put in the cost of that item. And this isn't something that we can put in for you because the cost is based on you actually measuring out and portioning the items in your thing. The industry estimates about 80% of your food cost is in the top 20% of them, your items sold. Meaning if I go ahead and make sure I'm putting the correct amount of cheese on my salads, then I'm also making sure that every one of my cheese is correctly portioned out for every other item that I use. If I put the correct amount of dressing on my number one selling salad, well then I've conditioned everybody to know what the right amount of dressing is for every other salad that's on my menu. And when we go through and we cost these out, and we put that percentage in, now we have a food cost here that shows in the cost, I can see what items I sold and what the cost of those items was, and I can tell that my actual food cost in my establishment now should be 36.68%. And that works both ways here. If I know that I should be at 36 based on the mix of products I sold, then one, I'm not holding my managers accountable for a 33% food cost and taking away their bonuses and making them chase something that's futile because they're never going to get there. But on the flip side, it also means if I'm at 38, I know exactly how much food. I can do the math backwards and I can say, okay, 2% of my food cost, what dollar is. I can calculate the dollars that are missing and say, okay, well then $1,700 in product is missing. Where is that $1,700 in food? Is it because it is a waste sheet and I need to readdress training with my staff and I'm going to look at it because I'm losing money because my broil cook is constantly burning medium rare steaks? Or is it because somebody walked a case of ribs out the back door and that's why? So it just helps us narrow down what we're actually looking for and the volume of the amount that we're looking for. Up in the front, there's some physical things. These are some screenshots I took just to show you some of the things that concern us when you're looking at physical security in the bar. The concern in this drawer, in this scene, is the 3 pennies and the nickels. If I'm ringing in a drink and then I notice you can't see my bar screen, so I collect the $5 from you for that import, and then I go ahead and delete it, and I put the $5 in the drawer because the customer expects to see me put money in the cash drawer. I need some way to remember how much money is extra in the cash drawer so I can take it out at the end of the night when I run my checkout. And one of the ways we do that is this. We can either take pennies and flip them into the nickels drawer, or we can move things into the wrong side. We can spill it over and it looks just like an accident. We could also go ahead and just move a penny across, so when it's sitting in front of the ones, I know that it's 1 extra drink has been rung in. When I put it in front of the fives, 2 extra drinks, and so forth. If you see those kinds of things, throw your staff off, push those pennies back where they belong, straighten up their drawers, organize their area, move the napkins and the cocktail picks and stuff away from the cash drawers. Best case scenario is you flub them up and then their cash drawer is over or under when they do their cash out at the end of the night because they couldn't get it right, and you know to keep an eye on them. Because if their drawer was over, then they were stealing from your customers. If it was short, they were stealing from you. Either one of those is something you should be keeping track of. I mentioned camera systems just as an overview. Those are both to keep control of the physical security, but like I said, we can also tie them into the system so that we are ringing in things. We're seeing them displayed on the screen, and you can make sure that they're ringing in the items that they're supposed to and the quantity of them that they're supposed to.